Hey guys, welcome to Crater Mania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater, and I'd like to welcome you all back to my 500 movies in 2025 series here on YouTube. And we are getting closer and closer to those 500 movies, folks. For tonight's episode, this will be movies number 420 through 432. So we got a big episode tonight, kind of a double size episode. So, and the not just for tonight, but like for on Sunday night too. There's going to be a double size episode as well. And the reason I'm doing that is because I've gotten a little bit behind. I meant to split this video up into two parts. Just didn't get around to doing that because got had some stuff come up during the week, got really busy. If you caught my last video where I talked about some of the movies that were released this year, 2025, such as Del Toro's Frankenstein and The Conjuring Last Rites, and also Death of a Unicorn. So if you haven't checked out that video yet, please go back and watch that. I appreciate that. But like I said, I did get a little bit behind this week. Just had some stuff going on with family. It's Thanksgiving. Just a lot of things going on. So I kind of got a little bit behind. I said, well, I got to do these two these two episodes of the Monsters of Rock, and then on Sunday I want to have my Thanksgiving special, which is a little late because I know if as of today, as the date of this video, yesterday was actually Thanksgiving and today was Black Friday. So first of all, I just want to say I hope everyone's watching had a great Thanksgiving this year. And if you do like the whole Black Friday shopping, I hope that went well. You guys were able to get some cool stuff, maybe some Christmas presents coming up for Christmas for your loved ones. But yeah, so as just to kind of keep to my word, like I said, I want to just bring together this kind of double-sized episode because I'm going to be talking about 13 different movies, and they're all going to be based around horror, fused with rock and heavy metal and just music in general. And just as many of you all know, if you follow the channel, if you've listened to me ramble on about things in the past, you guys know that I'm a huge horror fan, and not only just that, but I'm a huge music fan, especially, hard rock, heavy metal, punk rock. But I love all different types of music. But, for tonight, I want to talk about these movies that I've watched this past week that kind of infuse horror and rock and heavy metal and all that together. So bringing those two things that I really love in this world, together for one kind of mashup. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So we'll get into that here in a little bit. And I will let you know that of all these movies I'm going to be talking about in this video, I had only seen two of them prior to doing this for the show. So 11 of these movies were a first time watch for me. And well, we'll get into that. I'll let you know how I felt about those. So this I may where there is so many of these movies I'm going to be talking about tonight. I'm going to kind of like run through them as quick as I can, so they may not be like as lengthy as of reviews as some of the other movies that I talk about. But where there is so many. There's 13 in all tonight. I'm going to be kind of going through these, kind of as quick as I can. Now, if I start getting into talking about them, like how sometimes I do, I can kind of go on and just it kind of goes on and on and on. Like, if I'm really excited about talking about it. But like I said, I'm going to try to keep these reviews as brief as possible where there is so many. So let's go ahead and jump right into that. With this first movie, so I did start watching this movie once before a long time ago, but I never finished it. So technically this is a movie that I haven't watched all the way through before until this week. But I was always intrigued by it, just the visuals that I see, online and like, people talking about it, in review, other channels on YouTube. And there's so many things. Like I've seen pieces of merchandise, like shirts and pins and all kinds of stuff from this movie. I'm like, I really need to dive into this movie again. Um, and for fans of horror who kind of appreciate, a deep satirical cut of a film, and also for rock music fans out there who just kind of crave that glorious excess of the 1970s, this movie can be seen as a cinematic masterpiece by so many. And I absolutely love this movie. When I was rewatching it again this week, like the first little bits and pieces of it, from the start of the film, um, I could kind of go back and see like why I started this movie once before but never finished it, because it is in a way kind of a slow burn. Um, and in case of the movie you're wanting to know what I'm talking about, this is Brian De Palma's 1974 fever dream, Phantom of the Paradise. And honestly, upon my research, I found out that this film was a box office failure upon its release. Um, but as I said before, I've seen so many people talk about this movie, and there's seems to be such a huge fan base of it. There's tons of merchandise out there for it. This movie has rightly risen, I think, through the decades to kind of claim its crown as one of these definitive cult classics of the 1970s. It's a loud, tragic, and just visually breathtaking fusion of just horror and that glam rock opera. Um, and let's talk about the tragic ballad of Winslow Leach. So, Phantom of the Paradise is just this magnificent, glittering tragedy. Brian De Palma, this was in his pre-Carrie, Baroque style phase. He just weaves together this gothic DNA of the Phantom of the Opera, and that moral decay of the picture of Dorian Gray, and that eternal struggle of just the whole Faust legend. And the result is this commentary on celebrity and corporate greed that remains relevant to this day. Um, but as I stated earlier, like I said, the tragic ballad of Winslow Leach, and Winslow Leach is played by William Finley, who delivers this performance of just heartbreaking intensity. Um, and Winslow Leach character is this aspiring singer songwriter whose cantata was based on Faust, is his life's work. And he catches the ear of this devilish music mogul named Swan, who's played by Paul Williams, who also wrote all of the brilliant score for this film. Um, and Swan is this legendary producer behind the label Death Records. And he's the proprietor of these highly anticipated concert venue called the Paradise. Um, so Winslow's journey from naive artist to disfigured monster is the movie's central horror arc. And Swan is like the Mistopheles in this kind of tailored suit. Is just he ruthlessly steals Winslow's music and frames him for drug dealing, and and has him thrown in to just this it's like a prison where his teeth are brutally replaced with cold metal. And this ultimate transformation occurs, during this failed attempt at revenge, where Winslow, he falls face first into this record press, and it scars the right half of his face, and just destroys his vocal cords. And so escaping the studio and adopting this black cape, and this iconic looking silver owl mask, which is so awesome. I love that mask. So he descends upon the venue, the paradise, just transformed into this phantom. Um, so this creature is just not, this kind of gothic remnant. He embodies the aesthetic of 70s shock rock. Just a figure, demanding, integrity amidst, the corporate chaos. And his initial, acts of terror, including nearly blowing up, the former Juicy Fruits, which is now the Beach Bums, this kind of like made up band for the film, are are fueled by rage and just a desperate need to hear his music performed properly, by the one singer that he believes can do it justice. And that's the talented and ambitious Phoenix, played by the lovely Jessica Harper. And I believe this was her first film, if I'm not mistaken. And, I've talked about Jessica Harper before, how I love her and Suspiria. And she's like a bucket list person for me that I would love to meet. But honestly, I don't ever see that happening, but never say never, right? But anyway, what truly elevates, Phantom of the Paradise, for the rock fan, is Paul Williams' spectacular and just, genre, defined score. The movie is not just set to music, the music is the plot, and Paul Williams perfectly captures just that kind of shifting landscape, of 1970s rock, just kind of savagely, satirizing the whole industry's like fickle nature. And we jump from like the 50 styles doo wop, of the Juicy Fruits to the surf rock of the Beach Bums, and it all culminates in this kind of magnificent, terrifying glam rock excess of Beef. And Beef is the screaming, glitter caked, male prima donna, and this, just a spectacular embodiment of just manufactured stardom. And his electrocution in the film by the Phantom, that's mid performance, which is just a scene of just pure baroque terror and comedy, depending on your perception of it, it's a highlight of the film. This is where the horror fan and the rock fan kind of unite. The Phantom's vengeance is always spectacular, and it's visual and just focused on protecting, just the purity of his art from Swan's industrial, corruption. um and Swan himself is, that epitome of manipulative cool. We learned that his eternal youth is maintained by this Faustian pact with the devil, via this kind of decaying videotaped contract, making him untouchable until the recording is destroyed. Um, which is, a brilliant modern twist on that whole classic legend. And his ultimate act of cruelty is planning to assassinate Phoenix during their televised wedding during the grand finale of Winslow's Faust cantata. So Brian De Palma's direction here is just perfectly suited, to the material. He utilizes split screen effects, extreme close-ups, just a camera that just rarely stays still. I mean, and that's typical of of Brian De Palma's filmmaking, and that's why I love him. Like, I'm so fascinated with just how he films stuff, such as you know Carrie and Blowout. Blowout is one of the best Brian De Palma films that there is. Like, you can't tell me any different. Like, it is that movie is fantastic. But like I said, like the camera here in Phantom of the Paradise, just it rarely stays still. It just drowns the audience in this kind of hyper stylized world, of the Paradise's stage. It's an aesthetic masterpiece of just excess, just capturing the sleaze and the spectacle, of that era in the 70s without ever kind of losing sight, of the kind of underlying tragedy of Winslow's lost soul. Um, so, though this movie initially failed to find an audience, it was perhaps too dark for a musical, too musical for a horror film, um, too much of a satire for mass consumption. I don't know. But Phantom of the Paradise definitely has found, like immortality in its own way as a cult classic. It paved the way for future horror musicals and, just remains this kind of vital time capsule, of the 1970s genre when it comes to movies. But for those who love, their horror films loud, their musicals dark, and their rock music kind of soaked in, glittering operatic tragedy, Phantom of the Paradise is, I think, essential viewing. Like, I'm so glad that I finally finished it for the first time, and I just end up. I love this movie. Um, it's I feel like it's like a masterpiece, of just kind of that cinematic fusion, proving that when true art is corrupted, the resulting vengeance can be the most spectacular show of all. So definitely check out Phantom of the Paradise if you can. I highly recommend it. Moving on to the next film. So for fans of Alice Cooper, and I'm a huge Alice Cooper fan, I've seen him multiple times in person at his concerts. So, and I love him as an actor. I mean, he was great in Prince of Darkness. He's great in Freddy's Dead. Just everything I've seen him, even his little cameo in Wayne's World. Just and for like I said, for fans of him and horror and just the raw energy of all of his music, this film, which is from 1984, and it's a Spanish horror film called Monster Dog. It might just be, the cult classic that you've been looking for if you've never seen this, if you're a fan of all those things that I mentioned before. But this isn't some sleek, modern masterpiece, nor is it a polished Hollywood production. Instead, Monster Dog offers this kind of unpretentious, B movie charm that, when viewed through kind of the right lens, if you know what I mean, um, becomes this kind of delightfully, entertaining ride, especially for those who, appreciate Alice Cooper's kind of unique brand of theatrical, horror, which is one of the reasons why I've seen him so many times in concert because I feel like he puts on one of the best stage shows that there's ever been. Um, but Monster Dog was directed by Claudio Fragasso, and this film plunges us into this world of Vince Raven, which is this rock star, this charismatic rock star played by none other than Alice Cooper himself. And Vince Raven, along with his girlfriend Sandra and this motley film crew, just embarks on this journey to his childhood home in Spain. And the stated purpose is to shoot this music video for his song Identity Crisis. However, this routine trip quickly descends into this nightmare, and just the countryside is just shrouded in fear due to just a series of brutal wild dog attacks, turning what should be a nostalgic homecoming into this kind of desperate fight for survival. So the plot with this movie unfolds with this kind of classic horror movie um, formula. So, we're introduced to Vince and his crew as they navigate this ominous landscape, and just the initial encounters are really cool here. Is that just the brutal mauling of Jaws, the caretaker, by this pack of these feral canines, and just that unsettling warning from local law enforcement about these escalating attacks. And these early scenes set a tone of this dread, just hinting at this kind of primal, untamed force at play. Um, and the crew's van, which is en route to the estate, ends up striking this German Shepherd, and Vince, in this kind of surprisingly tender moment, ends the suffering of this animal. Um, so this act of mercy is soon overshadowed by the appearance of this blood-soaked old man, this who becomes like this harbinger of doom, who warns them of their impending demise, specifically excluding Vince. So he has these kind of cryptic pronouncements that really add another layer of um, of mystery and unease, and it kind of reminds you of like I think his name's Ralph, from Friday the 13th. Like, you're all doomed. It's a death curse. So it kind of reminds you of that, like in this movie, that the old guy that they run into. So upon arriving at this isolated house, like I said, Joss is missing, and Vince's concern leads him on this search that uncovers this crucial detail, this, which is a book on werewolves. And this discovery, kind of coupled with Angela's terrifying nightmare where Vince himself morphed into this werewolf, it just kind of plants that seed, of the whole werewolf mythology in the audience's mind. Um, so the movie then kind of skillfully, weaves in, Vince's personal tragedy, the story of his father, who had suffered from just the same curse and met this horrific end at the hands of, this pitchfork wielding mob. Um, and this backstory really provides just a tragic yet fitting, explanation for Vince's potential transformation. Um, so the movie, it kind of brings up the tension with this arrival of his film crew for another music video, "See Me in the Mirror," and the discovery of Joss's mangled corpse crashing through a window is a gruesome highlight here. And also the following arrival of these four armed men who swiftly kind of take control of the situation. It really introduces this kind of human element of danger to the already supernatural threat that's going on. So all this ensuing chaos, sees these wild dogs return and create this kind of multifaceted, assault that leaves, none of the characters truly safe. Um, and the final act here and culminates in this heart wrenching, confrontation between Vince and Sandra. As Vince begins his agonizing transformation into, this monster dog. Um, Sandra is forced to make this ultimate choice, and that he's putting down the man she loves, to prevent him from becoming a monster or dying, basically. Uh, So the legacy and the impact of this movie is, admittedly niche. It's not a movie that revolutionized the horror genre or anything, nor did it achieve any kind of critical acclaim. However, those I think who connect with that kind of specific brand of low budget horror, which I'm definitely one of those people. And its star, like, it's the impact is undeniable. So Alice Cooper, for Alice Cooper fans, he seeing him in this leading role, even in a film of this caliber, is definitely, I think, a significant draw. He brings this kind of characteristics, stage persona to the character of this Vince Raven, and just lending this kind of undeniable magnetism, and just a touch of just rock and roll swagger to the proceedings here. um and the movie serves as this kind of fascinating artifact, of his foray into acting, and just showcasing, that natural charisma, even, amidst all the gore and suspense. Um, and furthermore, Monster Dog, just really embodies that spirit, of 70s and early 80s horror. It embraces just these practical effects, which are sometimes crude, but always, I think, effective in their own, visceral impact. Um, the wild dog attacks, while perhaps not, terrifying by today's CGI standards or whatever, they carry this very raw animalistic ferocity that is just genuinely unsettling at times. Um, and the movie's pacing, while occasionally uneven, it contributes to its kind of its cold appeal. It's a movie that doesn't take itself too seriously. It allows for moments of just genuine terror to be kind of interspersed with that campiness that defines many genre films of that era. Um, and just for fans, of this particular brand of horror, just the kind found in like these dimly lit video stores and late night cable broadcasts. Monster Dog, I think, is a welcome throwback, and in conclusion, Monster Dog is a film that rewards, I think, patience and just a particular set of tastes. I think it's a love letter to creature features. I think it's a showcase for, Alice Cooper's acting chops, and just a guilty pleasure, for a lot of horror fans, including myself. Um, I had never seen this. Like, this is one of the movies that I had never seen before as well. And I ended up loving this. I can definitely see myself watching this again and again. Um, and while it may not be, a masterpiece, I think that its enduring appeal, lies in its, unpretentious execution. Its commitment to these creature feature thrills, and just that undeniable star power of Alice Cooper. So, for anyone who just enjoys a good dose of rock and roll horror with this healthy dose of werewolf mayhem, Monster Dog is a howl out loud good time. I mean, I think this was a great, and I know that's very cheesy and cliche for me to say, but really, I had a good time watching this movie, and it's kind of hot in this room. Forgive me just a second. I won't turn this fucking fan on. All right. Sorry about that, guys. I said it was getting a little bit warm in here, so had to go turn my fan on. But anyway, so let's move on to the next movie. And this next movie, this is one of the movies that I have actually seen before. Um, Me and my friends watched this back for the first time when I was in high school, which was over 20 years ago, and we always had such a good time with this movie. Um, and for a lot of us who kind of just grew up, on that kind of steady diet of just distorted guitar riffs and VHS tapes, that are always adorned with just excessive gore. You know, I think that the 1980s were just a golden age of midnight movies, and tucked away, you know, in that kind of anarchic catalog of canon films, there was this movie that doesn't just embrace the cheese of the 1980s. It's it builds a cathedral to it, so to speak. And that film is Krishna Shah's utterly baffling, brilliantly executed masterpiece in my mind of low budget mayhem, 1985's Hard Rock Zombies. And this isn't just a horror film. Um, it's just this kind of cinematic lightning bolt of this glorious heavy metal fever dream that just demands, I think, reverence from any true fan of rock and shock. This is such a fucking fun movie, man. Um, Hard Rock Zombies centers on Holy Moses, which is this metal band led by this charismatic Jesse, and they are optimistic and ambitious, and just utterly unaware that their manager Ron has led them straight into this the most absurd, deadly gig of their careers, um, and this movie wastes no time escalating proceedings from standard, fish out of water comedy to jaw dropping horror. If so, upon arriving, the band encounters immediate irrational bigotry, culminating in this town council meeting that bans rock music, outright. But the true danger really lurks at this mansion of Elsa and her family who lure the band in. And the escalating violence, complete with this kind of shockingly brutal, weed whacker murder, is just genuinely unsettling. But it serves only as a setup for the movie's kind of central audacious reveal, and we'll get to that in just a second. So the plot of this hinges on this kind of ancient Latin text, and Jesse, who's practicing a song based on this grimoire, inadvertently resurrects, this dead tarantula, a hilarious demonstration of, the impending zombie magic. Um, and after Holy Moses is brutally murdered by their host, including Eva, who's revealed to be a werewolf, their loyal friend Cassie plays Jesse's tape, the resurrection song, and the band rises from the grave, not as heroes, but as these undead rockers who are seeking vengeance. Okay, so then the film shifts from standard horror to full blown surrealism when the killers are finally revealed. And Elsa's father is none other than, you guessed it, Frank Stallone. No, I'm kidding. Adolf Hitler. So yeah, and I'm not kidding about that either. So like, it's the her father is none other than Adolf Hitler, who has faked his death, and alongside Eva Braun is running this Nazi cult intent on establishing the Fourth Reich from this small, unassuming, Californian town. Um, so this plot twist is really like insane. It simultaneously, satirizes the moral panic, surrounding heavy metal. Like we're the demonizing rock fans as as the ultimate evil or whatever. By just making the censors the literal historical monsters. And when Holy Moses exacts revenge, they aren't just fighting ghouls; they're fighting these Nazi ghouls, and just the ensuing zombie epidemic is fueled by the band's metal music, and which converts the the bigoted townsfolk and these newly zombified Nazis into this army of the undead. And the ending here is just this beautiful mess of gore and guitar solos and just incredibly like insane Like just complete stupidity. Just the surviving townsfolk who are desperate to stop the onslaught. Decide the only solution is to sacrifice this virgin, which is Cassie, as a sex slave for the zombies. Um, and it's just a moment of just pure low budget genius. It just showcases the movie's kind of cynical, comedic edge. Um, and their manager Ron manages to convince the band to rise for one last performance, using the power of rock to distract these lumbering masses long enough to lure them into Hitler's hidden underground chamber and poison gas them, which is a climactic end that kills both the zombie Nazis and the resurrected heroes. So naturally, the movie concludes with this kind of final romantic scare as Jesse's hand clutches lovingly, at Cassie, promising this kind of eternal rotting love or whatever. Uh, but Hard Rock Zombies, it never achieved mainstream success, um, nor was it nor was it intended to. Like its legacy, I think, is cemented in just the horror subculture, as that ultimate example of a movie that was unafraid, to throw every conceivable ingredient into that kind of cinematic pot. You have metal and zombies and werewolves and Nazis and grimoires and teen romance and slapstick comedy. Um, and I love like the scene when they have like all the shields. It's just these posters of all these celebrities like Jimi Hendrix and I think Elvis and Marilyn Monroe and John Lennon. I think is on one of them. It's so bizarre. Um, and it represents just the very best, I think, of 1980s independent horror. Just a raw, enthusiastic commitment to kind of concept over a polished film. Um, so for fans of rock music, the band Holy Moses delivers these surprisingly catchy original tracks that just genuinely motivate the action. And just for horror fans, the practical effects and just the over the top gore, especially the zombie transformation sequences are just so so fun to watch. But more than anything, the film's staying power comes from that sheer, magnificent audacity. It stands as this kind of glorious monument to the absurdity of that decade. And I think it's a mandatory viewing experience for anyone who appreciates when B movies kind of dare to dream big and evil and are very loud. Um, but if you prefer your horror served with this kind of generous side, of heavy metal and these kind of no joke jaw dropping plot twists, just and a script that just treated primarily as a suggestion rather than a rule, then you owe it to yourself to track down Hard Rock Zombies. Um, I just think it's one of those perfect midnight, movies to watch with your friends, just because it's this loving, just celebration of just genre fusion that just has earned its place, amongst the most cherished of these independent, B movies of the 80s. Um, and I mean, it's an insane cult classic. So definitely check out Hard Rock Zombies and Holy Moses forever, guys. I mean, check this movie out. But moving on to the next film. So again, this next film is another film that I had never seen before. I actually had never heard of this movie till last year. Um, because I can't remember who released it. I think it was Vinegar Syndrome that released this on Blu-ray. Um, so you know, when it comes to horror and the sounds of 80s rock music, um, just the landscape of B movies kind of often holds these hidden, some if sometimes challenging, movies. And this movie was just called Blood Tracks from 1985. It's a slasher film. It kind of falls into that category. Um, it offers this kind of unique, although flawed, blend of these, of horror and heavy metal and or hard rock music from the 80s. And it's Blood Tracks is this Swedish American film that directed by Mats Olson. And the premise is the classic 80s slasher fare, and you have a film crew, including members of this Swedish rock band called Easy Action, which I think they're credited as Solid Gold in the movie or whatever. Um, and they venture into this snowy, Colorado Rockies to shoot this rock music video at this abandoned factory. And their kind of creative endeavor is abruptly interrupted when this avalanche strands them, and it cuts them off from the outside world. And this isolation quickly turns deadly as they discover that they're not alone. So there's this reclusive and murderous family, residing in the factory itself, and have hinted at having a history of just inbreeding and cannibalism, and they begin to stalk and prey on this unsuspecting crew. And the film setup, particularly this the isolated, deranged family, just clearly draws inspiration, from The Hills Have Eyes and just these other, mountain survival horror flicks of that era. Um, but from a production standpoint, Blood Tracks exhibits just the hallmarks of that low budget 80s effort, and the film's financial constraints are evident. It's in various aspects. From the earnest yet sometimes amateurish, acting performances to that often kind of rudimentary choreography in its action sequences. I think a notable characteristic is just the frequent use of that dark, underexposed cinematography, particularly during many of the kill scenes. And then this choice foregoes, direct visual gore in favor of, abstract darkness punctuated by screaming, which can be a point, of frustration for viewers, that are accustomed to clearer visuals. Um, and the band's music, and like their on-screen antics are undeniably just rooted in this kind of specific brand of 80s rock, um, which for some will be kind of a nostalgic draw, but I think for others its style might kind of prove divisive. um, Character development is minimal, with the rock band members often portrayed as these kind of like self-absorbed figures who, you know, dialogue occasionally borders on the absurd. Um, just making them less than sympathetic victims, for the audience. Um, but despite these limitations, the film does have some points of interest. I think, the opening sequence depicting this mother's desperate escape, with her children into this snowy wilderness, after this domestic tragedy. It just effectively sets this somber, if not entirely clear, tone for that escalating horror. And just the decision to shoot, the Colorado Rockies scenes in Sweden provides some kind of genuinely, picturesque, if stark, I think, snowy landscapes that serves as an effective, backdrop for the unfolding terror. Um, And just for those interested in the historical context of 80s horror, the movie also includes elements of just that sleaze and nudity, that's in a lot of 80s movies. Just it's just typical, of the genre's kind of exploitation, leanings during that period. Um, so Blood Tracks has not garnered, significant cultural impact or any kind of lasting legacy in mainstream cinema, at least. It remains largely just this obscure artifact from what I've seen, of the 80s, slasher boom. Um, which is, a period that's saturated with films, attempt to capitalize on just these popular horror themes. Um, but its impact is primarily confined, I think, to just these dedicated genre enthusiasts. Because, like I said, I had never even heard of this movie till last year, because I think it was Vinegar Syndrome that released it. Um, and but for those that who actively seek out just every entry in the slasher subgenre, or just films that explicitly blend horror with a rock music theme, you definitely want to give this a shot and just make your own opinion of it. Because that's the thing, like, even though like I'm not super crazy about this movie, I think it is interesting. I think it had things about it that was entertaining to me. Um, and but that's just my opinion. And definitely, I encourage people who have not seen it to at least give it a shot and form your own opinion on it. Um, to me, this movie serves more as just was a curiosity, or um rather than kind of a widely recognized or influential work that that's out there, that's mainstream, that so many people would know. Um but Blood Tracks is a film that is best, I think, a best approach with just the right expectations. It's a deep dive into that world of low budget 80s horror, and it offers this this blend of just slasher themes and rock music, that will just appeal most to a very specific, niche audience. Um, and while it's technical limitations, like the questionable lighting choices and that often unsympathetic characters, can make for sort of a challenging viewing experience. I do think its unique premise, and just that authentic 80s aesthetic might hold a certain charm for fans of the era. It's not a masterpiece. I'll say that. Nor is it a forgotten classic. But for those who just revel in the quirks and of obscure horror cinema, particularly with a hard rock soundtrack, I think Blood Tracks offers this kind of glimpse into a very specific corner of film history. And yeah, definitely check it out. Um, and Yeah, so I mean, like it's out there. Like I said, Vinegar Syndrome released this, I believe. Um, and so it is out there on physical media if you guys want to try to hunt it down and watch it. Or just if there's other ways to watch it out there for you guys, definitely just take time and check this one out. But moving on to the next movie. So this next movie, this is another one that I had not seen before, but I'd always heard about this one. I know this is a very early entry, of that was produced by Charles Band when it was still under, I think, Wizard Video. This was pre Full Moon, I think. Um, and just as someone who has loved, just horror again and rock music, approaching this movie, which is uh David Decatow's 1986 offering, Dreamaniac, I thought, just based off the cover art, alone, that I would probably love this movie. But I should have known better. As I grew up in the '90s and was going to video stores and uh, rented plenty of movies on tape that had awesome cover art, but was not awesome movies. Um, so unfortunately, this is one of those movies, and it just kind of it's one of those particular gems, if you want to call it that, that shines with a dull, tarnished glow, which more it's more indicative of its low budget roots than any kind of true cinematic brilliance or anything. Um, so Dreamaniac presents this kind of Faustian bargain, which seems to be kind of a recurring thing with a lot of heavy metal horror movies. But like I said, Dreamaniac presents this kind of Faustian bargain with this decidedly uninspired twist. And so there's this guy Thomas Byrne, um, who's in his I think there's this sole uh, acting credit. I think this is the only thing he's ever been in. He plays this struggling heavy metal musician whose desperate desire for female adoration just leads him to strike a deal with this satanic succubus who's portrayed by Sylvia Summers. Um, and the pact is simple, success with the opposite sex in exchange for the succubus being granted the right to feed on the souls of these newfound admirers. So this premise, while kind of offering a glimmer of exploitative 80s horror potential, just quickly dissolves into this sluggish, almost lethargic narrative. And Decatal, David Decatal is just who is, I think is a name that is synonymous with the later era of low budget genre for Empire Pictures, was clearly still finding his footing here under the Charles Band umbrella. And Dream Maniac exemplifies that less successful side of this partnership. So the film opens with this extremely long credit sequence, um, each name lingering on black and just an early warning sign of the pacing issues to come. This is followed by a dream sequence featuring this naked man in a hallway, a visual that feels less unsettling and more just conceptually adrift. um, for a movie that clocks in at a mere 82 minutes, the runtime feels significantly stretched, just leading to moments where one might question if the script was intentionally designed to test the viewer's patience. Um, it just it's hard to imagine how a few more scenes, couldn't have been injected to at least inject a kind of semblance of momentum. Um, and just adding to the movie's kind of dissonance is that tonal dissonance is its portrayal, of its heavy metal, main character. Um, just the choice to have him sporting a Def Leppard T-shirt while sporting posters of Poison and even the Dead Kennedys, it just kind of makes you scratch your head a little bit. Um, so while eclecticism in music taste is understandable for just a character supposedly dabbling in devil worship, the band selections are kind of questionable. So one might expect the soundtrack to resonate with the darker, more aggressive sounds of bands like Venom or Bathory. Instead, the score, which is by Don Great, who also contributed to Breeders, is largely forgettable. I gotta say, while there's this faint dreamlike quality to some of the music, it desperately lacks that edge and that sheer, sonic power that would have truly, complemented that supposed dark themes and the main character's supposed, musical leanings. Um, but the legacy and the impact of Dreamaniac are, for all intents and purposes, just visually non-existent. For fans of obscure '80s horror, it kind of remains a footnote. I think, just a curiosity from a prolific but often inconsistent director. Um, its lack of memorable moments, its uneven tone, just that kind of sluggish pacing have just ensured that it has never achieved cult status, or garnered any kind of significant critical attention. Um, it's a film that likely lingers only in the memories of those who unearthed it, during its initial limited release, or through these kind of subsequent bargain bin discoveries. Um, Honestly, I do remember seeing the cover of this on VHS at video stores growing up, but I'd never rented it. I'd never seen this movie until this past week. Um, but in conclusion, Dream Maniac is a movie that promises much in its premise, but it doesn't deliver too much on that. While just the allure of a satanic succubus and just a heavy metal musician might pique the interest of genre enthusiasts, um, the sluggish pacing, the questionable aesthetic choices, just a score that really just falls, or I'm sorry, that just fails to ignite any sense of dark energy, make it this difficult watch. It's a relic of just a particular era of filmmaking, one that just unfortunately prioritizes quantity and concept over compelling execution, just leaving the viewer dreaming of a more engaging horror experience. So this might be one of the very few movies that I don't recommend watching. And so, I mean, if you guys want to check this movie out, you're more than welcome to. But I think this is a one and done for me. I don't have any plans to watch this movie again. Um, but if you'd like to, it's out there. So, moving on to the next film. Now this next movie I really did like. And it's another one of those first time watches for me, and just for fans of low budget genre cinema. I think the name Albert Pun is synonymous with you know just with this that audacious vision that's delivered through sheer grit. But even within his famously eclectic catalog, um this movie from 1986 is a sci-fi horror musical hybrid, called Vicious Lips, and I think it stands alone. This is not just a cult film. This was a neon drenched fever dream, just a beautiful incoherent mess that perfectly captures that kind of that aesthetic and that manic energy of the mid 80s rock scene, and just filters it through this kind of warped creature feature lens. um if you believe the best horror requires high volume and even higher hair, then this film is a cosmic headliner for you. Vicious Lips launches us um, into the future where this interplanetary travel is common, and and the style just reigns supreme. We meet this girl band, the Vicious Lips. You have Bree Sin, Winsy Croto, and Mandoa. Um, and they're kind of reeling from the death of of their lead singer, Ace. So enter this girl named Judy Jetson, of course, which I don't know how they didn't get sued by Hanna-Barbera for that. But Judy is this replacement singer, plucked from this local talent show by the band's oily, relentlessly neurotic manager, Maddie. Um, and the plot kicks off with this kind of quality that lesser viewers might call clumsy writing, but which we recognize as this kind of pure, unadulterated camp momentum. And Maddie scores the band this gig at the Galaxy's hottest venue, which is the Radioactive Dream, and the band impulsively steals this spaceship. Well, Maddie steals the spaceship, and the band doesn't really know about it. Just only to immediately crash land on this deserted planet, thanks to this poorly navigated asteroid field. Again, Maddie's fault. And this is all before, just the 30-minute mark of the movie. So they're stranded in this kind of desolate wasteland, and the band discovers that they aren't alone. So imprisoned in the ship's holding cell is this murderous Venusian beast that's now loose and is hungry. So for the horror and rock fan, Vicious Lips is defined by its glorious, unhinged aesthetic. And director Albert Pun, just treats the camera like this kind of hyperactive, you know, um, metronome, just utilizing these, relentless jump cuts and, editing choices that just actively subvert that kind of typical narrative flow. And far from being a flaw, this kind of chaotic pace, I think ensures the film feels frenetic and unpredictable, and just mirroring that kind of high strung paranoia, of their situation. And similarly, the soundscape is just a distinctive, like the dialogue is often drowned out by the band's, frantic squabbling or by bizarre, repetitive audio cues that are so, um, they they're so egregious that they become charming. And I think that's a signature element, of its kind of profound, lo-fi brilliance. Um, but the real star, of this spectacle, however, is the production design by Bob Zembicki. Despite the shoestring budget, Bob Zembicki, managed to create this immersive astropunk world where glam rock went interstellar, and the from the neon lit clubs and bizarre altar esque offices are just tragically underutilized, yet provide this kind of stunning visual proof that this is an alternate universe where the 80s never died, and they just bought a spaceship, and then the visual flair combined with that hilariously cheesy practical effects, the space travel looks like cheap cardboard. It gives the film this kind of analog charm to it that I think modern CGI productions that simply cannot even match. And even the Venusian beast, who's this classic kind of rubber makeup and suit monster, just delivers this reliable creature feature thrill about the movie, just providing that kind of necessary threat with practical flair. Um, and while the band members embrace this kind of new wave cool, characterized by sometimes lethargic delivery, um Matty Asher, just is brilliantly portrayed by Anthony Kent's, and just he elevates the entire experience. He just performs at this fever pitch of neurotic panic and constantly sweating and nervously going. Nah. He carries the film's just that comedic energy and just embodying that sleazy, high strung manager type essential to just any great rock tragedy. Um, and the music itself, the soundtrack is this very dreamy, synth heavy new wave pulse that is just, I think, it's utterly infectious. And while some might expect that aggressive sound of like the music from the Return of the Living Dead, Vicious Lips delivers just pure spectacle. Each of their big songs is delivered just in full. Shot like this kind of stylized music video, and just padded out to perfection. Um, the payoff, particularly the explosive energy of that final song, is exactly the attitude and swagger that rock fans crave, I think. And Vicious Lips is a perfect storm of genre collision. It's a creature feature, it's a apocalyptic thriller, it's a feature length new wave concert. It's kind of, it has this cinematic execution that might be messy, but that disarray is precisely why it works. I think it's a midnight movie masterpiece. It's a true testament to that B movie ambition, and just that I think it's required viewing for anyone who loves the rock and roll served with the side of rubber monsters and astronomical amounts of hairspray. It's loud, it's cheap, it's absurd. So definitely take the time and check out Vicious Lips. Um, I absolutely loved it. But moving on to the next movie, uh, and this is another movie that I was really surprised by, and I've known about this movie for a long time, just had never got to watch it. Um, and this will be like the first of John Fasano's movies I'm gonna be talking about just in this episode. So I'm gonna actually talk about two of his movies, and so this will be the first one, and this is his 1987 masterpiece, Rock and Roll Nightmare. So more than just a quirky genre curiosity, this movie is a vibrant, pulsating testament to 80s independent filmmaking. And I think it's a love letter to heavy metal and just a deliciously bizarre slice of horror heaven that has, I think is rightfully earned its status as an enduring cult classic. If you're looking for a, slick, polished, scares, then you need to look elsewhere. But if you crave, originality and practical creature effects, a killer soundtrack, um, and just that muscular presence of a heavy metal legend, then you need to prepare for a nightmare that you'll never want to wake from. This movie, I loved it, and I can't wait to watch this one again at some point. But Rock and Roll Nightmare, which was also known by the name The Edge of Hell, is this Canadian direct-to-video horror film that just encapsulates everything wonderful about low-budget 80s genre filmmaking. Um, like I said, it was directed by John Fasano, who was a man who clearly understood just the power of a wild premise and a charismatic lead. The film stars the one and only heavy metal musician John Michael Thor, or otherwise known just as Thor. And the plot is straightforward, as a power chord, yet as twisted as a guitar solo. It follows the band Triton as they go to this isolated farmhouse in this rural Ontario, Canada. And their mission is to record some earth-shattering new music. And their unwitting predicament is that the farmhouse is, unbeknownst to them, this hotbed of demonic activity. Um, so joining the band members, are their significant others. You have John's girlfriend Randy, Roger's new wife Mary, and Stig's girlfriend Luann. Just adding a touch of kind of domestic drama to this brewing supernatural chaos. So initially, the group grumbles about the lack of just modern distraction. Um, but soon, the music takes over. However, the true show stealers are the unseen forces at play. And it's these insidious demons. They begin their work, subtly at first, then with just this kind of increasing menace and murdering, possessing the souls of the group one by one. As the body count rises and just the paranoia intensifies, and just the practical effects, gleefully embrace just that grotesque charm. The film reveals I mean, the film reveals in its creature designs, just delivering this kind of menagerie of rubbery, slimy, and genuinely inventive monsters that are, just pure 80s B movie gold. You can practically smell the latex and the fake blood, and it is absolutely glorious. Um, the film builds its tension, around that unraveling sanity of the band, until only the frontman Thor's character John is the only one that remains. But just when you think that you've got this low budget chiller figured out, Rock and Roll Nightmare pulls this audacious, jaw dropping twist that elevates it from mere schlock to just truly inspired genius. I mean, the twist is what really made me truly like love this movie. I was like, holy shit, this is awesome. This is so strange, but this is so fun. Um, so frustrated by his inability to claim John's soul, Beelzebub himself appears in a moment that has to be it has to be seen to be believed. John reveals his true identity, that he is not just a rocker, but he is the archangel known as the intercessor. And he further explains that the entire supporting cast, Randy, Mary, Luann, and the rest of Triton, never actually existed. They were merely shadowy constructs, just this bait designed to trick Beelzebub into manifesting in the mortal realm. And what follows is this epic, no holds barred fight to the death between the intercessor and Beelzebub. Just a clash of titans punctuated by Thor's incredible physique and almost theatrical performance. Um, the intercessor naturally emerges victorious, and the film closes with this chilling, final shot of a suburban home accompanied by this foreboding music, implying that the demonic threat is far from vanquished and could be lurking anywhere. It's an ending that's both kind of mind bending and perfectly encapsulates, that film's unique blend of horror and heavy metal and just pure, unadulterated fantasy. Um, and I think the legacy and impact of this movie is far greater than its humble direct to video origins might suggest. I think it has cemented its place as this definitive cult classic in my eyes. And it's beloved, I think, by generations of horror fans, because I've had so many people suggest this movie to me over the years, and I'm really kicking myself for waiting so long to see this. Um, and because I said, it's beloved by generations of horror fans and just metalheads who appreciate, its kind of audacious spirit and that singular vision. And Thor's performance is without a doubt the beating heart of this film, with that that chiseled physique and that theatrical flair and just that unwavering commitment to the role of the intercessor makes him this iconic figure, I think, when it comes to B movie horror. He fully embodies, that larger than life persona that just defines, heavy metal and transforms what could have been, a forgettable B movie into this unforgettable experience. And the film's unique blend of like heavy metal aesthetics, from the band's look to the pounding soundtrack, and like there's one song in particular in this movie called "Energy" that like I'm in love with that song now. Like I listen to that song like every day. You can ask my wife because because as soon as like I heard it, like you gotta hear this song. This song is amazing. I love it. So I've been listening to that song Energy every day. Um, but then tack onto that like the practical effects, the creature horror that created this kind of niche that few films have dared to explore. I think with such gusto. Um, but Rock and Roll Nightmare, it isn't just one of those so bad it's good. To me, I think it's legitimately good in its own right. It's succeeding wildly at being everything it sets out to be. It's that DIY charm, coupled with the genuine creativity and just the sheer audacity, of its plot twist has ensured, that longevity. It influenced a wave of subsequent low budget horror features and remains a go-to choice for a lot of people out there. And it's definitely going to be one for me from now on, I think. The film proves that heart and vision and just a willingness to push boundaries can overcome any kind of budgetary limitations. It's a testament just to the power of of independent cinema, and just a reminder that true gems can often be found in the most unexpected places. But in conclusion, for any fan of horror films and rock music, Rock and Roll Nightmare is an essential viewing experience, in my opinion. It's just a wild, unpredictable ride that blends quintessential '80s horror themes with this heavy metal attitude and a twist ending that I think will leave your jaw on the floor. And just Thor's, you know, charismatic performance, and just the inventive practical effects, and just that unforgettable soundtrack really make this movie a genuinely unique entry in the whole horror canon. Um, um, it's more than just a movie. I think it's an experience. It is a head banging, demon slaying fever dream that you'll want to revisit again and again. So definitely crank up the volume, prepare for the unexpected, and let Rock and Roll Nightmare remind you that sometimes the best scares come with a killer riff and a whole lot of muscle. So yeah, definitely check that out. This movie, it's on YouTube. I think it's under the name The Edge of Hell, but the full movie is on YouTube if you want to check it out. Um, I highly recommend it. Um, So moving on to the next movie, this next movie is another movie that I had not seen before, and so just for those of us again that are obsessed with that kind of gritty neon soaked underbelly of the late '80s genre filmmaking, was the era where horror went straight to video. Um, just armed with rubber masks and glorious hair metal soundtracks. Lone Wolf from 1988 is less a forgotten movie, and just more of a really like kind of an underrated, when it comes to the heavy metal horror, subgenre. It's a film that perfectly, I think, encapsulates that spirit of where it's rough around the edges, wildly enthusiastic, and just utterly essential. I think for connoisseurs of cult cinema. This isn't just a werewolf flick. It's a creature feature. Set to this relentless drum beat, just kind of making it mandatory viewing for fans of both screams and power chords. Um, Lone Wolf drops us into this small town in Colorado where full moons bring more than just tidal shifts. It brings this carnage to the town, and there's these grisly attacks. Seemingly the work of this wild animal or a pack of dogs that's plaguing the area, and the local authorities are stumped, but the audience knows better here. Give me 1 second. I just need to get a drink real quick. Sorry about that, guys. But so our main character here is Jamie Newcomb. He's this perpetually brooding lead singer of this local rock band, where he teams up with this motley crew of college students just to unravel this mystery. The film shifts into it shifts into gear as this kind of high concept, almost like comic book horror. It plays out like this fun, quick moving slasher, only with that kind of tantalizing possibility of a genuine, monster lurking in the shadows. And what makes Lone Wolf inherently charming is just its complete just comfort in its low budget skin. It was shot direct to video with these no name actors. The tone is this kind of sublime mixture of half serious horror, and just outright hammy fun. It's the kind of production where the cast clearly had a blast, and that energy is just infectious. While some might grab for the blockbuster examples of the genre, um, you know I think I would watch this just as much as I would, something like in that atmosphere of Silver Bullet or The Howling or something. This movie really possesses this kind of raw enthusiasm that just um, the more contemporary efforts um, you know may have simply lacked in some spots. You know what I mean? Um, this film embraces its limitations, I think, beautifully. Among them is the bizarre casting. So we're told these are college students at this ambiguous Fairview school, yet many of the lead actors, especially Deidre and Eddie, look definitely past their 30s. um, the creators smartly kept the school's nature vague, and the production team had to shoot where they could afford, which is clearly a high school set. um, but these quirks are features, not bugs. They solidify the film's identity as this product of necessities, adding to its authentic kind of ground level charm. um, and for the rock fans, the true appeal of Lone Wolf is just its spectacular hair metal, integration. The the main character here, Eddie, is the front man, and just the sonic landscape is defined entirely by this band called Tyx. Um, and their sound is just pure 1988, asphalt rock, the kind of like music like Dokken or Rat or Warrant. And so Tyx contributed 4 tracks to this movie. It was all written by Greg Leslie, which serves as the film's kind of muscular backbone. And like the songs "Raised on Rock and Roll," "Misunderstood," "Let It Rock," and "Rock You All Night." And these songs, evidently lifted from the band's 1988 demo tape, are just perfectly integrated into the film's aesthetic. Jamie Newcomb looks and acts like these tracks sound, shredding guitars, big hooks, and just a healthy dose of that kind of dramatic bravado. The the rock isn't just background noise. It's the genre fuel that drives the mayhem, I think. Um, and and just in terms of mainstream impact, Lone Wolf, it it remains one of those deep cuts. Like again, this is another one of these movies like I had not heard of until here very recently. Um, but from what I can see, its legacy is strong within the sphere of just cult nostalgic horror. I think it from what I can see, it serves as a perfect time capsule. Marrying these practical effects, of a creature feature, of the '80s with that emerging MTV aesthetic of the whole hair metal scene. Um, and that impact, I think lies in its sincerity. It proves that a great genre experience doesn't require, a Hollywood budget. It requires this creative enthusiasm and a killer soundtrack. And for genre fans, especially those who spend their weekends digging through dusty VHS tapes or whatever, looking for just that perfect blend of spandex and splatter, then Lone Wolf, I think, stands as a triumphant example of just that micro budget horror done right. Um, so if your ideal werewolf flick features leather jackets, and these fantastic, if non-existent bands and actors, enthusiastically, mugging for the camera, then definitely look no further than Lone Wolf. Lone Wolf is raw and loud and just delivers exactly that kind of cheap, magnificent thrills that just, epitomize the late '80s horror. So definitely check this one out for sure. Um, and you see, I've done a lot of werewolf movies this year. Looking back on, I won't need to count altogether how many I've done so far. But like, as you know, like if you watched my World of Werewolves series back earlier in the year, um, it's one of my favorite subgenres. So I was definitely glad to add this one to the list of, especially one that I had never seen before. But moving on to the next movie, so. Speaking of werewolf films, here's another werewolf film based around heavy metal. So Hard Rock Nightmare is a decidedly deep cut from the late 1980s. This came out in 1988 as well. Just attempting to marry the decade's prevailing slasher sensibilities with the aesthetics of the heavy metal scene. And crucially, any viewer seeking this title must first be warned. Um, so do not confuse this film with the film I talked about earlier, which is Rock and Roll Nightmare, which stars Thor. This is an entirely separate, less polished, often baffling piece of cinema that offers this kind of peculiar, viewing experience. Um, Appealing mostly to those who relish that accidental camp and tonal inconsistency of just regional horror. Um, so the film centers on this band called the Bad Boys. They're this up and coming group whose visual style is as eclectic as their sound, and just ranging from standard long haired rockers and leather clad greasers to a member looking conspicuously like a Mike Mills esque nerd wearing a Nike sweatshirt. Their signature song, despite having the chorus "It's a Nightmare," features earnest lyrics, centered entirely on just the hard work required to start a band. Example like starting with the first guitar at age 10, that kind of stuff. Just the mix of this gritty imagery and just profoundly ungritty lyrics, just sets the stage for the film's kind of overall confused identity, I guess you could say. Um, so after this kind of impromptu garage practice, attracts both swooning girls and this interference police mandated shutdown, the band and a few hot babes retreat to Jimmy's grandma's secluded farm to rehearse. Um, and this retreat instantly introduces the supernatural element. So Jimmy suffers these strange premonitions, amplified by the revelation that a murder took place at the farm years ago, which is initially misreported as involving a woman, but actually involves his grandfather. And just the core of the conflict begins, when the group focused less on musical expression and more on achieving just the classic rock and roll dream of getting laid. That it finds their weekend interrupted by this genuine terror. So the first death occurs after this cringeworthy attempt by the drummer, who's also the guy in the Nike shirt, to solicit sex. He's instantly and graphically decapitated by what appears to be this monster, specifically a werewolf, which removes his head with just the ease of hitting a baseball off of a tee or something. Um, but from this point, Hard Rock Nightmare pivots awkwardly between serious supernatural horror and that low grade farce. So the band members react poorly to the mounting body count, just descending into frantic arguments and just bizarre, poorly conceptualized plans. Um, Jimmy begins ranting about vampires and werewolves and demanding silver to fashion bullets out of a mirror, which is a process for which he possesses neither the tools nor the expertise. Um, and just adding to the kind of instability is that peculiar subplot involving Tina, this groupie who reveals herself to be this music journalist. Um, so this professional angle, aiming to create intra-band intrigue by focusing on a potential real star, is jarringly introduced just as members are actively being impaled or ripped apart. And further complicating her character is a bizarre scene where she brutally taunts Charlie about his inadequate performance, sexual performance, before withdrawing her offer, of a magazine story. Um, so the film excels in just delivering these baffling character choices, such as the decision by one victim to climb into a deep well, not while being chased, but just simply as a place to is a place to kind of hide out for the night. And this, of course, precedes just an ill-fated explosion that the victim just lucidly observes and just noting a wolf couldn't light a match. Um, so the director here is Dominic Brascia, who previously played Joey, the one that got hacked up in Friday the 13th Part 5, New Beginning. Um, the the son of Roy, I guess you could also say. Um, and he just also throws in this. He's in the self-aware humor, even to the point where he has a couple of characters discussing the Friday the 13th theme and the and all that. And just as the title implies, the rock music element is largely incidental. Um, beyond the opening sequence and just the central band dynamic, the film could have replaced the Bad Boys with any generic group of teens, heading to a secluded cabin. Um, there's no involvement of Satanism, occult rituals, or even music related jealousy fueling the violence. It's just a remote location and an unknown monster. But the ending provides the movie's ultimate tonal collapse. It's a full-on Scooby-Doo ending, basically. So once this wolf is shot, the group unveils the monster to be Dirk, in a costume, working under the instruction of Jimmy's Uncle Gary. And Gary is attempting to scare Jimmy into the nut house so he can acquire the farm for its lucrative oil reserves. So this reveal is delivered, via this lengthy self-congratulatory speech by, his Uncle Gary, who is now seen as the villain, just undercuts all previous attempts at supernatural suspense and just lands this film firmly in that territory of just comedic absurdity. um, so Hard Rock Nightmare holds any kind of minimal mainstream legacy and is just primarily a curiosity for completists of 80s slasher cinema or fans of just actors associated with earlier horror franchises. And just while it lacks that polish or genuine craziness of its contemporaries, its deeply confusing plot points and that amateur charm and just that kind of nonsensical, you know, um, villain reveal really make it a fascinating study in that low budget, genre filmmaking. It's certainly not high art, but for those who just enjoy, that clunky, ill conceived, and just thoroughly bizarre, um, this film offers definitely a messy cocktail of horror and unintended comedy. Uh, so, I mean, I would say definitely check this one out just to see how absurd it is and just kind of gather your own thoughts and opinions on it. But definitely not one I'm going to be watching multiple times and repeat viewings. Um, but definitely worth checking out, I think, at least. But moving on now to the next movie. Got a few more of these to go through, guys. Like I said, this was going to be a long one tonight. Um, so this next movie, um, you know, so among all these kind of delightfully campy gems that I've already talked about, this next one, which is, and I'm probably butchering this guy's name, but his name is Dimitri Logothetis, who directed this film from 1988 as well, and it's a supernatural shocker named Slaughterhouse Rock. It just really this one stands out as a unique fusion of demonic possession, ghostly hauntings, and of course, just killer rock music. This isn't just a horror movie, it's kind of a musical event, a fever dream that was set against just the iconic, imposing backdrop of Alcatraz Island. And it continues, just to resonate with a kind of a dedicated legion of horror and music fans. Um, so Slaughterhouse Rock introduces us to Alex Gardner, this college student, is plagued by just increasingly vivid nightmares, and these aren't your typical bad dreams. Alex experiences just the brutal deaths of a doom rock band that met their untimely end on Alcatraz long before it was a prison. And as these visions bleed into his waking life, manifesting in just these unsettling ways, like levitating over his bed, his occult savvy teacher, Miss Holland, advises him to confront the source of his torment, and that's the island itself. Um, so just believing the ghost of the killer who claimed, the band's life is the root of his terror, Alex, along with his group of friends, embarks on this, trip to the Rock, which is, Alcatraz Island. Um, so what they find is just far more sinister than they could have imagined, as they soon become stranded and just um, they become stranded, and the island's malevolent forces begin to take hold, and just the situation escalates dramatically when Alex's brother Richard becomes possessed. and just unleashing this wave of violence, upon their friends. And in this desperate struggle, Alex finds this unexpected ally in the spectral form of Sammy Mitchell, who's played by Tony Basil. And Sammy is the former lead singer of the ill-fated band Body Bag. And Sammy, who is just this vibrant presence, even in death, attempts to guide Alex, teaching him these arcane abilities like levitation and out of body travel. Um, so her presence is punctuated by energetic, dance sequences that are just pure 80s flair, and just, adding another layer of just pure spectacle to that unfolding horror. So the film culminates in this climatic showdown within the prison chapel, where Alex, just armed with Sammy's spectral guidance, must confront the killer's ghost and his possessed brother to break this curse. And the legacy of Slaughterhouse Rock is a testament to the enduring power of cult cinema, and just that unique appeal of its genre bending approach. It's a film that doesn't take itself too seriously, and embracing its kind of inherent B movie charm with this gusto. And its impact lies not in its critical acclaim or box office dominance, but in its cult following, a group that just appreciates that unbridled energy. Um, and it's surprisingly effective scares for its budget, and just most importantly, its killer soundtrack. The film tapped into that late '80s, that was still reeling from um, just the visual, um, and that sonic excesses of hair metal, and just that burgeoning popularity of that occult themed horror. Um, and in the performance of Tony Basil, both as the ghostly mentor, and in her captivating dance numbers, is a standout here. And just encapsulating the film's vibrant, slightly unhinged spirit. And furthermore, I mean, the film's willingness to integrate musical performances, so directly into the narrative was a bold choice. Um, that while divisive, has just become a hallmark of its identity. It's a film I think has paved the way for other genre blending endeavors, proving that horror could be just as entertaining with the pounding drum beat, as with the chilling scream. And in conclusion, Slaughterhouse Rock is more than just a forgotten horror flick. It's an experience. It's a pulsating supernatural thrill ride that just successfully marries the macabre with the musical. And for those who appreciate the darker side of rock and roll and the fun, often campy nature of '80s horror, this film remains an essential watch, I think. Um, it was a first time watch for me, but I can definitely see this as one of those really great horror heavy metal films, or hard rock heavy horror hard rock films. It's because it just has this unique blend of demonic possession and spectral intervention, and killer songs that just makes it this timeless cult classic that I think will continue to echo through just the annals of horror history, just proving that sometimes the most memorable scares come with a killer soundtrack. But now this next movie that I want to talk about, now this is one I have seen multiple times, and I talked about Trick or Treat um, last month here on the channel, and I think it is like the definitive, like the ultimate heavy metal horror movie. But this next movie is right up there with it, because in the 1980s, when it comes to that steady diet of both heavy metal anthems and VHS horror rentals, there's a special place in our hearts for these movies that dare to blend these two beloved genres. You know, and like I said, while Trick or Treat often gets that spotlight, um, you know, I think there's one of these other there's another unsung hero out there, that is undoubtedly the second John Fasano film I'm gonna be talking about tonight, and this is the 1988 masterpiece of mayhem, Black Roses. And it's more than just a cheesy B movie. It's a vibrant, unapologetic celebration of everything that made the era great. And just wrapped up in this genuinely creepy and endlessly rewatchable package. For any fan who yearns for the days when special effects were practical and soundtracks, ripped and high school dances could literally turn monstrous. Black Roses is an absolute essential. Um, so, at its core, Black Roses delivers this simple yet effective premise. We're introduced to this sleepy conservative town of Milbasson. This a place that was seemingly untouched by just these electrifying currents of 80s youth culture. And our protagonist is Matthew, played by John Martin. He's this high school teacher who, like many adults, tries to maintain this kind of semblance of control over his impressionable students. Um, and this fragile peace is shattered when this heavy metal band, ominously named Black Roses, rolls into town, slated to play these 3 nights of concerts. Um, and initially, the town's parents, led by this surprisingly, uh, this mayor played by Julie Adams, or I'm sorry, not Julie Adams is not the mayor. So I forget the guy's name is the mayor. I always I get them confused, but they're the band's kind of they're just kind of like taken aback by the band's seemingly mild mannered appearance. But Matthew is this man of just uncanny intuition, or perhaps just a good judge of bad vibes. Senses something far more sinister lurking beneath their leather and the leather and the lace facade. He's right, of course, because this isn't just any band. This is just a conduit for pure unadulterated evil. And what follows is this escalating spiral into suburban nightmare. So as the Black Roses performances continue, the town's teenagers undergo this terrifying metamorphosis. So gone are their normal, mundane concerns, replaced by this homicidal glee and just this rampant, antisocial behavior. So the real fun, however, begins when the parents start, paying that ultimate price for their skepticism. We witnessed some truly inventive and just, spectacularly gruesome deaths, including this unforgettable scene where this parent is literally devoured um, by their own record player and speaker. Um, and it's a very absurd yet viscerally shocking moment that just perfectly encapsulates the film's blend of practical effects and that dark humor. Um, and Matthew's favorite student, Julie, when she transformed into this jealous killer, dispatching his ex-girlfriend, Priscilla, in this fit of demonic possessiveness. And just realizing that the third and final performance will unleash just this irreversible chaos, Matthew has to take matters into his own hands. He's determined to burn down the performance hall, and his confrontation with Damien, which is the band's charismatic leader who transforms into this formidable demon, is definitely a highlight of the film and is culminating in Matthew successfully waking the teens from their trance and just seemingly destroying the band. But in this kind of classic horror twist, there's a news report at the end that reveals that Black Roses has not only survived that fire, but are now playing these mega concerts in New York City, and they're heading overseas to the UK. And so the evil, like a catchy guitar riff, just simply refuses to die. Um, and the legacy and the impact, I think, of Black Roses is deeply rooted in its kind of uncompromising embrace of that 80s identity. It stands shoulder to shoulder with other music horror films of that era, but distinguishes itself with this kind of infectious energy and these truly memorable monster designs. Um, and for any metalhead, the soundtrack alone is worth the price of admission. So it features genuine, like, songs of the era, like, and bands of the era, like King Cobra and Tempest and Hallows Eve and Lizzie Borden. um, Black Roses isn't just generic rock music. It's practically this time capsule of 80s hard rock and metal. And just the fact that the fictional band Black Roses actual music was performed by members of King Cobra with Marcy Free's vocals and Carmine Pice's drums. It lends this kind of incredible authenticity to the band's on-screen presence. This isn't just a movie about a metal band; it's a metal movie through and through. But beyond the music, the film's practical effects are a magnificent testament just to 80s creature design. The transformations of the teens, the grotesque demons, just especially the iconic record player monster, are all just delightfully tangible, um, and just wonderfully unsettling. There's this very raw, tactile, quality just to the horror that CGI just simply can't replicate. And I know I say that a lot, but it's just the truth. Um, Black Roses, it also just it taps into that kind of recurring generational fear of the era, just that perceived corrupting influence of heavy metal on youth, and while played for these supernatural thrills, it cleverly makes a satire of that moral panic that surrounded rock music of that time, just turning parents' worst nightmares into this monstrous reality. Um, so this blend of just genuine scares and over the top practical effects, and just that these perfectly pitched heavy metal anthems has really cemented its status as a beloved cult classic. It's a film that resonates with nostalgia. Just delivering this powerful dose of adolescent rebellion and that demonic rock and roll that still gets the audience headbanging today. But in conclusion, Black Roses is so much more than a forgotten horror flick. It's a pulsating, head thrashing tribute to the golden age of both horror and heavy metal. Um, it's a film that fully understands its audience, and just delivering on every promise of its kind of audacious premise. With its killer soundtrack, the wild practical effects, just genuinely fun scares, just undeniably charming, 80s aesthetic. It is definitely a must watch for anyone who ever found solace, in a loud guitar riff or a good monster movie. So definitely just crank up the volume with this film. Embrace that absurdity and just let you know Black Roses drag you into their unique brand of rock and roll, and heavy metal. You won't regret it. I love Black Roses. Um, but moving on to the last two films I'm going to be talking about for tonight's show. Um, This next one is called Dead Girls. It's from 1990, and this was a film by Dennis Devine. It was a direct to video slasher, and it feels like exploring a forgotten corner where these two passions intersect. While it's not a household name, and when it comes to horror, its unique premise really promises a blend of just musical rebellion and these classic slasher themes, and it really makes it a very intriguing watch for anyone, with a similar appreciation for both of those genres like we've been talking about. Um, so Dead Girls centers around this female fronted death metal band, also named the Dead Girls, consisting of Gina, who her stage name is Bertha Beirut. You have Dana, who is stage name is Lucy Lethal. Amy, whose stage name is Nancy Napalm, Susie, who is Cynthia Slane, and then there's their drummer, which is the only man in the group. His name is Mark, and his stage name is Randy Rott. So the film's concept immediately grabs attention, being directly inspired by, just the moral panic surrounding rock music in the 80s, specifically the lawsuit against Ozzy Osbourne for his song Suicide Solution, which allegedly, influenced teens' suicide, which I think is bullshit, but whatever. So this real world fear, provides this kind of fascinating backdrop for this horror story. Um, so the film opens by establishing the band's identity. They're loud, they're provocative, and they're relying more on shock value and these morbid lyrics than any kind of genuine musical talent. Aside from Mark, their drummer. So they're their manager already, attempts to push them towards mainstream appeal, a move that they resist, and this internal conflict is just quickly overshadowed when Gina's teenage sister Brooke attempts suicide along with these other fans, in this apparent kind of emulation of the band's dark aesthetic. And while Brooke survives, Gina is thrust into this blame, from her conservative aunt and uncle, who they're holding the band responsible for this. Um, and just to help Gina recover, the group decides, on a 2-week vacation to this remote mountain cabin. And Gina brings Brooke along, along with her assistant Jeff and this, nurse that's overseeing Brooke's, recovery. Um, which is a decision that's met with reluctance. Um, but before they even depart, the sinister tone is set. With the first murder, Artie is brutally, taken out in just his office by this skull mask killer. And at the cabin, the group encounters Elmo, who is this, special needs, I guess you could call him, developmentally disabled handyman. I have to be PC here, folks. So the tension escalates quickly here, though. So Mark brings this groupie to the property, who is later forced to leave and becomes the killer's next victim in the woods. And Susie is then drowned, in the lake, her body disappearing before police can investigate. Just leading the sheriff to dismiss Gina's claims as a prank. A reference to Susie's on stage fake deaths. So paranoia begins to fester now, and with the discovery of Susie and Jeff's corpses, in a barn, and the group finds themselves stranded when the nurse leaves with Brooke for a hospital visit, inadvertently taking their only vehicle, and the phone lines are cut. So, as suspicion starts to mount even more, Dana attempts to pin the murders on Gina and Amy, while Amy, who is this military combat enthusiast, sets traps. And the body count continues to rise with Amy brutally dismembered by an axe. And in a shocking twist, Dana reveals that she and Mark had planned to murder Gina and Amy, believing them to be the original killers. And Gina is forced to kill Mark in self defense, only for Dana's throat to be slashed by the actual masked killer. So there's chaos everywhere in this movie. But the ending sees Gina fleeing into the woods, pursued by the killer. And Elmo briefly appears, mistaken for the killer by Gina, before Mike, Gina's childhood friend who had been unable to contact her, arrives and bludgeons Elmo to death. So, in his final chilling reveal, we finally see that the killer is Mike. So, Gina's childhood friend, he confesses to being the murderer, driven by just extreme religious views and a belief that the band promotes evil. So, he binds Gina in the barn amidst her, victims' corpses, but is, accidentally killed by one of Amy's potassium nitrate bombs. Um, so the film's bleak ending sees the nurse, return with Brooke, only to leave Gina bound and gagged, disgusted by this perceived sadistic game that the band has played, sealing Gina's fate. So Dead Girls, I even though this is another first for me, I think it largely remains, this obscure entry in the slasher canon because I'd only recently found out about this movie as well. Um, and just due to it in no small part to its direct to video release status in 1990 or anything, but this limited distribution meant that it didn't achieve, that widespread recognition or any kind of box office success, of its theatrical contemporaries. Um, but despite its kind of intriguing premise and that real world, anxieties that it tapped into, regarding music's influence on youth, the film never really garnered, a significant, cult following, though it occasionally, resurfaces in discussions, among dedicated slasher fans, like I said. So like I only found out about this recently, actually through a friend, when I was trying to put some of these movies together to watch, and this was recommended to me. I said, hey, I think you would really like this movie called Dead Girls. So it definitely does have its fans, and just its primary legacy might be as an interesting, although perhaps unpolished, artifact of early 90s horror. Just reflecting that tail end of that, satanic panic era that demonized heavy metal and, other counterculture music at the time. Um, so, ultimately, Dead Girls stands as a testament to that diverse and often experimental, nature of independent horror, and just willing to to tackle just these controversial themes within the established framework of a slasher film, even if its execution didn't quite elevate it to a cult classic status, so to say. Um, but for a fan of horror and of rock, um, Dead Girls offers it just a fascinating, I think, a flawed peek into a unique subgenre. While the film's initial premise, promises a sharp critique of this moral panics and the music industry, its execution often leans into conventional slasher territory. At times feeling a bit rough around the edges, as is common with, direct to video features of that era. Um, just the band's lack of musical talent, highlighted in the plot, is ironically reflected, in some aspects of the film itself. Um, However, the sheer audacity of its inspiration, just and the escalating body count, just the multiple twists, keep the viewer engaged. It's not a masterpiece, but it is enjoyable. Um, it's an enjoyable ride for those who appreciate just the intersection of metal and mayhem, and just serving as a curious relic of a particular time in both music and horror history. So yeah, I would definitely suggest checking out Dead Girls. Um, but that brings me to the last movie that I'm going to be talking about for Monsters of Rock. Um, so this last movie is from 1991, and the whole intersection of heavy metal and horror cinema is a fertile ground for cult classics. While films like Trick or Treat, Hard Rock Zombies, serve as these kind of nostalgic, touchstone for those who appreciate the era's excess. 1991's Shock 'em Dead, often known as Rock 'em Dead, emerges as this fascinating, if deeply flawed, late entrant to the genre. This was directed by Mark Freed. This is a low budget production in this kind of quintessential time capsule, blending that Faustian horror yet again, mythology with just the extravagant aesthetics of the waning glam metal scene. Um, so again, another movie I had never watched before, and approaching this movie as both as I'm a fan of both horror and a fan of just of heavy metal. Um, and I'm just one that finds a film that succeeds in its ambulance and musical authenticity, while just struggling substantially with that kind of story cohesion and that technical polish. It stands as a compelling piece of direct to video cinema whose significance is often tied directly to that surprising caliber of talent that it managed to secure. um and Shock 'em Dead centers on Angel Martin, who's this perpetually frustrated musician, um toiling in obscurity. So just desperate for the fame and adoration associated with 1980s rock gods, Martin strikes this supernatural bargain. This the classic trade of his soul for this unimaginable music prowess. Um, so the deal propels him to instant stardom. Just complete with the accompanying fortune and seemingly endless supply of beautiful women. Um, However, the price of the success is gruesome. Angel must feed on the souls of others to maintain his new life and his skills. And the film quickly morphs into this horror vehicle as this series of brutal killings, plague, the locations surrounding the band's concerts. Um, and in managing this newly skyrocketing act is Lindsay Roberts, played by Tracy Lords, in one of her early post-adult film roles. So Lindsay, finds herself overwhelmed by the sudden success and just managing contracts and concerts and just increasingly intimate encounters with this magnetic angel. And as the body count rises, Lindsay is drawn into Angel's dark, mysterious world, just setting the stage for this kind of black magic confrontation against the ultimate evil. So the film was co-written by Mark Freed, David Tedder, and Andrew Cross, and it's ostensibly a thriller with a comedy twist. Offering this self-aware, if often cheesy, commentary on the narcissistic, predatory image cultivated by certain metal guitarists of the 1980s. And visually, the film adheres strictly to the era's aesthetic. That teased hair, spandex, excessive close-ups of guitar shredding, and theatrical stage presence. It also holds historical footnote status as the final film appearance of screen veteran Aldo Ray. Um, but I want to talk about the true star of this movie. So, um, before I had, after I watched this movie, I did research. But while I was watching the movie for the first time, I knew that the music sounded familiar. And then when it would show the close-up shots of the guitar playing, especially the double neck guitar, I'm like, hold up, that's what Michelangelo Bascio plays. And I said, that sounds a lot like his guitar playing. So I was surprised to learn that Michelangelo Bascio had big involvement in this, as that is actually him playing in the close up like double shots of Angel playing the guitar, especially the double neck guitar. I was like, well, that's why I need to use it, because that's actually Michelangelo Bascio playing that. So for fans of rock music, if you don't know who I'm talking about, I feel like this is the greatest thing about this movie, just because of the involvement of the guitar legend Michelangelo Bascio, just renowned for his blinding speed playing and invention of that double neck and quad neck guitars. Even just the production, team recognized that to sell the premise of Angel Martin as a supernatural, guitar god, they needed authentic world class talent, and Michelangelo Bascio served as, like I said, that character double, providing, the lightning fast, fret work and seen on screen, and just that recording, the soundtrack's core guitar tracks. So director Mark Freed had emphasized the necessity of bringing Michelangelo Bascio on board. When he said that, when they finished writing the script, it was obvious that the movie was going to need more than just an average guitar player to, emulate that role of Angel Martin. Um, and this character double, needed to be, a heavy metal, highly skillful, guitar player with just this dynamic stage presence. Um, and Michelangelo Bascio's commitment went beyond just recording. He was integral to, the visual effects, playing, the role of the demon in Martin's dream sequences. And crucially, Mark Freed confirms, a point often debated by fans from what I've read, that many fans have asked, if Michael's, you know, um, guitar parts were sped up in the film, and the answer is absolutely not. What you see in the film is, in fact, Michelangelo Bascio playing with no special effects, and if you're a fan of him, then you know exactly that is the truth. Because to me, Michelangelo Bascio is one of the greatest guitar players that there ever was. Just so I remember when I first saw him years ago, it was some kind of music program. I can't remember if it was on MTV or VH1 or whatever it was, but just like because I had never seen the dual necked guitar before, because he innovated that, and because you have like one going out this way, one going out the way, and he's like playing them simultaneously, and I was like, holy shit, I'd never seen anything like that before. I thought that was amazing. And the producer here, Robert Decker, he provided further insight into the studio sessions, revealing that the raw 1990 direct to video production environment, that he recorded the band tracks in his studio, um, and utilizing these Korg workstations, and these Emax 8-bit samplers, and a Roland um, rhythm composer, just recorded on this 1-inch 16 track. And for his parts, Michelangelo Bascio arrived with his signature Dean twin neck guitar, though for just that precision during the short record window, he primarily recorded just the complex solos on a single neck guitar. just later verifying that the parts could be accurately performed on the dual neck instrument is actually shown in the movie. Um, so this genuine high level musical participation really lends, the film this credibility that's rarely found in, bargain bin horror musicals. Um, and just as a low budget independent feature, Shock 'em Dead presents this uneven viewing experience. Stephen Quadros, who plays Angel, you know, fully commits to that seductive, demonic rock persona, just embodying that glam metal attitude of just arrogance and that over the top styling. And Tracy Lords, while still finding her, footing in mainstream acting at that time, brings this undeniable charisma and just, energy to that role of Lindsay Roberts, just often, grounding the more outlandish elements, of the plot. However, the film suffers, I think, from many typical direct to video failings, and pacing can be sluggish between the musical set pieces. The supporting performances are highly consistent, and just the special effects are rudimentary, just relying on standard stage fog and minimal like visual gimmickry to kind of convey the supernatural elements. Um, the film attempts to be both a horror flick and a comedy, um, but the execution often lands firmly in the realm of campiness. Um, the horror is just simple slasher fare, kind of tied to occult mythology, and just the comedy relies, heavily on the absurdity of just of the rock lifestyle. It's a parody of. Um, its true success lies just in the synergy, between just the visual, rock aesthetic and just the that incredible guitar work. Just the film feels authentic, in its musical presentation, even if the acting talent surrounding is kind of hit or miss. Um, but Shock 'em Dead is not a highly polished cinematic achievement, but its neutral assessment reveals its kind of substantial appeal as a cult object. Um, it was released just as grunge was beginning to kind of choke the life out of the whole hair metal era. And so this film exists as just a perfect snapshot, I think, of a musical subculture's final desperate attempt at cinematic representation. Its legacy rests primarily on its status, as a niche favorite for those who appreciate the merger of glam rock sleaze and low budget, vampire mythology, or and just genuine kind of musical virtuosity. It's necessary watch for fans, I think, of Michelangelo Baccio's work, and and just provides this kind of interesting, historical marker for Tracy Lords' transition into, conventional acting. Um, but ultimately, Shock 'em Dead, delivers exactly what its title promises, and that's a messy, energized, and just frequently outlandish B movie experience. Viewers must adjust their expectations for technical finesse, but those who appreciate the camp flair and just genuine musical talent that define the era will find this rock and roll movie possesses a flawed yet infectious charm. It serves as compelling evidence that even in the schlockiest of horror cinema, that sometimes the music does truly matter. Um, but guys, that is it for me tonight. I want to thank anyone who has watched this either live or if you're watching this on replay. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed listening to me talk about these movies as much as I enjoyed talking about them. Please drop me a comment below on what your favorite of these movies are, or just tell me about what your favorite heavy metal horror movie is if it's none of these that I've talked about. So, and tell me why. So I'd love to talk about that with you in the comments. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that. And if you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button below for more videos like this one. So like I said earlier, the next video that I'll be doing will be this Sunday, where I'll be doing my Thanksgiving special, where we'll be talking about a bunch of movies that are based around the holiday of Thanksgiving. I hope all of you had a great Thanksgiving this year. I hope you guys had a great Black Friday. I know Christmas is coming up next, and we're going to get once December hits, we're going to hit deep into a lot of these Christmas classics, whether it be horror or comedy or drama. I'm just going to be doing tons and tons and tons of Christmas movies starting in December. So hope you guys can join me for that. As always, click that bell for any kind of future notifications. But with all that said, I'm Crater. This is Crater Mania. I love you guys. Have a good night.